Perfectly paced books. You know those books that you read sometimes where there's a beginning, middle, and an end, and all three are bangers? Where there's no dead weight, no wasted pages, no wasted POVs, and you're invested in every part of the book? My name is Nick Hill with Shelf-Esteem, and I'm here to talk about my top 10 perfectly paced books. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Again, I'm Nick Hill with Shelf-Esteem. I'm a composer, now booktuber. You can find my music in The Wheel of Time Season 2, His Dark Materials Season 3, and the newly released psychological horror film, Dead Whisper. So I wanted to talk a little bit about something I don't actually see as oftenly discussed on YouTube, on BookTube, and it's something where I always try to find like ideas that I haven't seen as much of. Just to kind of add some variety into the mix. So this is one that I hadn't seen too much of, and it's something that, I think as book lovers and, kind of reading multiple genres and things like that, we're always on the hunt for books that don't feel like they're dragging. You don't want to hate read through anything. It's supposed to be a wonderful experience, a kind of nice escape from reality for a little while, right? We're always trying to choose books that, kind of grab us from the very beginning and don't let go until the very end. And so this was kind of the impetus of this list. The way I structured this list is these are in no particular order because I think it would be insane to try to rank any of these. Some of these are short books, some of these are chonkers. And they're very different writing styles, different genres covered as well. So that's the first caveat. I'm going to just kind of present these as 10 books that I really think are perfectly paced books. And I would also love to know in the comment section if you have more to add to this list. If you disagree with any of these, all opinions are valid. All opinions are welcome. That's the golden rule of this channel. Is I always love to have discussions with you all, and it's great to have a dialogue between us and talk about the books that we love and the books that should be more highly ranked on people's lists. So without further ado, if you like this kind of video, please like and subscribe. Always helps out the channel. We have a brand new Discord, small but growing community. You can find that in the link in the description. I'm an Amazon affiliate, and I'm posting some of these links as well for these books, so you can check them out and purchase them if you so choose, and that helps out the channel as well. Now, one more caveat I want to mention also is I'm choosing one book per author because, frankly, Stephen King is my favorite author of all time, as you can tell from my shelf back here, and if I had it my way, I probably would have made this whole list Stephen King, but I don't want to do that, obviously, and so I decided to make it a rule that it's one book per author, and so that's kind of my list. So let's get right into the books. So the first book is an interesting one because it's 950 pages or so. So you would think that's got to have a, kind of a slow middle or something, right? Like there's got to be a part that drags of this book, and I tell you, no, there isn't. And it is Swan Song by Robert McCammon. So for those of you who haven't read Swan Song by Robert McCammon is fast becoming one of my favorite authors of all time. And he just writes banger after banger of a book. And this particular book is about a nuclear holocaust and the aftermath and kind of the survivors and what happens to their story as they try to rebuild after this. How do humans face a crisis like this? Do they evolve, to transcend it? Do they devolve and become, each other and their own worst enemy? So that's kind of what the book poses. And right from the first page, it just grabs you. There's a couple of opening lines in there that like hit right in the feels. And it is kind of a cry for humanity in a lot of ways. And, it's very prescient of the times currently. But what I love about this book is the character work. I mean, the character work is so brilliant that you care about each particular survivor that's mentioned. Even the ones that are kind of a victim of circumstance and a victim of their own egos. You kind of care about what happens to all of them. And that I think that is a fascinating thing, especially in a sprawling epic like this. So that's one thing. And the second thing is like, there is a good versus evil story in there, but it just keeps you riveted because the pace is still breakneck, it doesn't just kind of sit in one area for way too long. So you're constantly seeing these different POVs and kind of like how characters are responding to this crisis. So fantastic book. If you haven't checked it out, literally from page 1 to the very end, it is a masterpiece. So that's the first one. The second one is another chonker because, as a fantasy fan, but then also reading historical fiction, sci-fi, and of course horror, I love my chunky books, and I'm sure a lot of you do as well. So I wanted to feature a couple of those on this list. And this one is no exception. This one I read earlier this year, shortly before I started this booktube channel, actually. And that is Shogun by James Clavell. Now, 1,300 pages on hardcover. Again, same thing, one would think. There's gotta be some dead weight in this, and also it's about a guy in the year 1600 who is a British sailor aboard a Dutch ship that goes to Japan and it crash lands there and has to try to learn, navigate this foreign culture and language that he doesn't understand in the year 1600. So it's the meeting of East and West kind of colliding, and also at a time when it was feudal Japan, the samurai were still around and everything. So could you just imagine what that must have felt like for someone at that time? There was no internet, there was no way of knowing about what was going on in other parts of the world. So fascinating thing, but again, it's there's a lot of dialogue, and you would think that this book is going to drag, but I really feel like this is one of those books that doesn't necessarily have, how a lot of books have that ending climax. That's the thing that everything has been gearing towards. This book ironically subverts that in a slight way, but I think that's what makes it so brilliant. Is because from the very beginning, again, it captures you. There's an action scene at the beginning. There's a ton of dialogue throughout. There's tons of action throughout, and it kind of balances those two really well. So by the time you get to the end, you just don't feel like there were any wasted pages or any wasted characters, and you know each one intimately. Very hard to do in a small book, let alone a big book. So Shogun is number 2. Now, number 3 is kind of dipping into fantasy. So I read Joe Abercrombie, and I'd read the First Law universe. I've been kind of making my way through his books. I'm about 6 deep now. And I just love his universe. And if you don't know much about him, it's kind of a grim, dark fantasy. So basically, it's kind of like a bleaker look on fantasy. Bad things happen. There are bad characters. There are no real good people in it, but there's redeemable qualities in these characters. And that's why we love them, even if we love to hate them or hate to love them. So that's kind of the impetus of this whole series. Now, this particular book that is in this series is a standalone. And this standalone is called Best Served Cold. So it's kind of got this classic revenge story, but it never goes quite the way you would expect. And, it kind of posits the question that revenge is a dish best served cold. But it's a very insular story in that, it takes place in a particular area of Joe Abercrombie's kind of First Law world, and it has a very specific set of characters, and it has a very kind of contained story. It's like a revenge story, right? But again, he makes you care about each character. And from the very beginning, every chapter is just perfectly placed, perfectly paced, and you just want to keep turning those pages, which is hard to do in a fantasy novel. I think fantasy novels are known for being very slow burn a lot of times, and I think this book subverts that. And because it's a standalone, I highly recommend, if you do read this, you should read the First Law trilogy that comes right before it, because otherwise you won't know necessarily the context of these characters or why they matter. But it is a standalone, and it does work as a standalone too. So if you were only going to try one book from that entire 9-book universe, I would say Best Served Cold is one of the best, arguably my favorite, and it's just a perfectly paced book. So that was the third one. Now, the fourth one, kind of dipping back into kind of the techno thriller, sci-fi elements and things like that, is Blake Crouch. Page Turner should be his middle name. It should be Blake Page Turner Crouch, because this guy, every book he writes is a page turner. But this particular one was the one that started it all for me, one that started it all for a lot of Blake Crouch fans that are currently reading his works now, and that is Dark Matter. This was also developed into a TV series, and I've heard it's very good, because I think Blake Crouch was the showrunner, or he had a lot of creative control over that. But this is basically kind of posits the question of, what if you were to wake up one day and your wife was not your wife, and you never had a son, and you were allowed to live a different life? Which is real, the life that you had before or the life that is now? And would it be worth the price that you pay? So really fantastic premise. Very mind-bending, but still very focused story, because even with a kind of hard sci-fi concepts and things like that, he grounds it in a family drama. So you really care about the family, and so it becomes this guy Jason Dessen, and kind of his story and how he tries to go back to where he came from. And I think that's just a fantastic way to do it. It's 300 pages or so it's a quick read, and there's just from the very beginning, it just starts off with a bang. and it never lets you go. So that is my fourth entry. Now, the fifth entry is kind of dipping back into fantasy. So this is a kind of a longer fantasy novel, and it is George R.R. Martin's A Storm of Swords, book 3 of his Song of Ice and Fire series, which I read last year. So I honestly think his first 3 books are all perfectly paced, but if I had to choose one, I would choose A Storm of Swords, and I'll tell you why. There is so much character development in this. There are characters that you hate in the first couple books that you start to actually really empathize for and kind of feel like, that's a different thing. Maybe this person is evolving, growing, changing. That's the first thing. Second thing, some of the most iconic moments in the whole series are in full display here. And I'm talking about from the very beginning, and then in the middle section, there's a huge event that takes place that, probably a lot of you even know about. I kind of don't even want to mention it because I feel like the name is kind of gives away what it could be about. So I kind of don't want to go there, but and there's some particular characters that go through some terrible things. There's some redemption arcs that start to happen, and even the ending, like the last chapter, I think it was, a huge event happens that kind of shatters the whole world in a lot of ways. So I just think that, like, for this many events, and there's tons of POV chapters in this as well. And again, you never get tired of switching from one to the next. And you never feel like, I wish I knew what the other characters were doing. I wish we didn't get to this POV chapter. Because even the POV chapters juxtaposition against each other are perfectly placed. And so this is the perfect fantasy novel, in my opinion, in a lot of ways. And so that would be my fifth book that is on this list. So let's kind of move back to sci-fi. So for sci-fi, my number 6 choice would be Andy Weir's Project Hail Mary. So Project Hail Mary, for those of you who don't know, a guy wakes up on a spaceship, doesn't know who he is, has amnesia. And then he starts to go, oh, interesting. I guess I seem to have scientific knowledge. Maybe I'm a scientist. And he's trying to piece together his life. And also kind of figure out, why is he the only person left on the ship, and like, where is he going, what is his objective, like, what's happening. And it also has some kind of like extraterrestrial contact type story. It has, it's a story about friendship, it's a story about duty, it's a story about one's place in the world. And these are kind of larger than life concepts in a lot of ways, and he packs it in just for it almost reads like kind of a sci-fi thriller or something, like a mystery. And I just love it when people do genre blends like that, where they're like, oh, we're going to come at sci-fi, but from a different vantage point than usual sci-fi. Then it starts to become something that is completely its own thing. And I got to say, like, from the beginning to the end, it's just, I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself on that, but it really is one of those books that it's like, again, no wasted pages. It was like 400 or 500 pages, I think, for the whole book, and it is a quick read. I read it, I think, in 2 days, if I remember correctly, and I'm not a quick reader. I take my time with my books usually, and especially at that time when I read it was a couple years ago, and I was much slower then than I am now. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't checked this out. I haven't read The Martian. I've seen the movie, but I've heard a lot of people say that Project Hail Mary is even better than The Martian. Which I've heard great things about. So definitely check that one out, and it's, in the link below. So that's number 6. Now, number 7, going back to the horror genre, and my favorite author, Stephen King. So in my opinion, a lot of his books are perfectly paced. There are some that are like, you almost had it, but then the ending is a little abrupt or something like that. And he's kind of known for having books that sometimes drag in the middle or go off on tangents. So I was trying to think about, like, what's the perfectly paced book? And I would have to go back to the first book I ever read of his, which is Pet Sematary. So Pet Sematary is basically a meditation on grief. It's about what you would be willing to do to see a loved one again. And it has some pretty harrowing moments. It feels like a slow burn because there's a lot of emphasis on character, about a particular character's past and their relationship with their sister, another particular character's relationship with alcohol and how he uses it as a balm on his wounds, and kind of his personal kind of wounds and things that he has to deal with in the novel. It's about kind of family duty. It's about just because you could doesn't mean you necessarily should. And then there's like a supernatural horrific element throughout. But even though it's a slow burn, you kind of see the trajectory of where this book is going, and still it keeps surprising you to the very end. So this one is like 300-400 pages, I think, if I remember correctly. And I gotta say, like, it touched me so deeply when I first read it when I was like 13, 14 years old. And then I read it again recently, like a couple years ago, and it felt that much more apt because as an adult, you can imagine what it feels like for the adults going through what they were going through in the book. So, highly recommend that. That's my number 7 choice. Number 8 is kind of going back to fantasy. This was one of the first fantasy books I read. I wasn't really well versed in fantasy. I never really read much fantasy consistently until maybe 2019 when I discovered the Wheel of Time series. But way before that, I was reading the Harry Potter series, and this was the first book that I read when it was released, and it was Harry Potter number 4, The Goblet of Fire. So the reason I'm putting this on this list is because I truly believe this is the perfectly paced Harry Potter book. So much happens in this. There's the Tournament of Champions. There's actual stakes for the characters. A particular character dies. There's specific things that have been building up to the 4th book, and he who must not be named and all that, and things start to kind of get fleshed out, come to fruition in this. This is a pretty big book. It's a chunky book, but it never feels like, let's get to the point already. You're just kind of breathlessly reading those pages. And I felt like, at least for me, that was the one that I never felt dragged. There are a couple books in the series, I think, later on that felt like they dragged a little bit. I think Order of the Phoenix, which is the one that comes after that, and then the 7th book, Deathly Hallows. There were a couple moments where it might have dragged a little bit, but I think this one was the one that was like, for being as big as it is, it packs so many different character arcs and plot points in, but you never feel like it's A, rushing through, or B, kind of taking way too much time. So very hard to strike that balance, and I think J.K. Rowling did that with this particular book. So that is my number 8 pick. Number 9 is another one from the fantasy genre, and this is Book 2 of the Stormlight Archive, Brandon Sanderson's Words of Radiance. Now, for an 1,100-page book, again, one might think, come on, this guy writes hard magic systems in his fantasy. He has magic evolving almost like a character would in his fantasy. He has character backstories, so many different POVs and all that. How can one balance that? And I feel like out of all the entries in the Stormlight Archive, and personally, I feel like out of any Brandon Sanderson book, this was the one where it felt like it never dragged. There were so many different concepts introduced in this. There was Shade, you start to find out more about Shadesmar. This is not spoiler because, no one would know if they haven't read the series what that is. But you start to find out more about these different things that were introduced in the first book, but it never drags at any point. And you kind of just start getting more invested in the characters and their backstories and things like that. And there is a redemption arc in this that I feel like is one of my favorite redemption arcs in all fantasy. So I just feel like this is one of those perfectly paced books, and I had to put it on my list. So that is number 9. Now, number 10, before I go into this one, I want to do an honorable mention because, this one could possibly go on the list, but it's just hard to say with this particular author which book actually belongs here. So I'm kind of leaving it here, but I would love to also know what you guys think. So let me know in the comments if you've read any of these, what you think about that. But this is Christopher Rocchio's Sun Eater series, and if I had to choose one book as an honorable mention, I would probably choose Howling Dark. Now, there's a couple of instances where you feel, where's this book going? Because it takes such a hard left turn from the first book and becomes its own thing. First book, you can kind of see elements of Dune. You can see elements of like different types of books, right? That it's been inspired by Star Wars and things like that. Now, number 2, it becomes its own thing completely. I think because so many concepts are introduced, it becomes almost dizzying in some ways, but it is perfectly paced in a lot of ways. So it's kind of hard to put it on this list, but I think it at least deserved an honorable mention because I don't think there's any dead weight in this book, and especially looking back on it now. But I remember when I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, what is happening right now? And so it's for that reason I kept it as an honorable mention, but it is one of my favorite series of all time, and definitely recommend you checking it out if you haven't already. Now, number 10, the final pick I have for this list is going back to fantasy, and that is one of the books from John Gwynn's The Faithful and the Fallen series, and that book would have to be Ruin, Book 3. So this is one where when shit hits the fan, the book. That's what it should be really called. But I think it lives up to the name Ruin in a lot of ways. There's specific elements of like a prophecy, I guess you could say, or like chosen one tropes that, a lot of fantasy explores and has been since its inception as a genre. But this is one that kind of turns it all on its head. And it kind of talks a little bit about the nature of prophecy. What does it mean for something to be prophetic, to be preordained? Diving into that, what's the nature of that? Now, what the main characters in the story go through, they get put through the ringer in this book. But again, it never feels gratuitous. It never feels like, okay, this is kind of hard to believe. It all feels kind of earned, and it kind of puts everybody in a precarious position where you don't know where the fourth book is going to go. It could go so many different places. There's also some fantastic side character arcs that you really care about as much as the main characters. There's Maquin, who's one of the main side characters, I guess you could call him. And you just fall in love with this guy. He's such a badass. And there's some great scenes of his in this particular book as well. And I just got to say, if you haven't read The Faithful and the Fallen, you got to check it out, because this is one where you feel, just emotionally invested in all the characters. And this particular book, I would say, is the most perfectly paced of his books so far of the, 8 or so I've read. So that was my top 10 in no particular order, perfectly paced books. Let me know, what did you think of this list? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Leave it in the comments. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. It always helps this channel. And I just really appreciate you all for being here and listening to me ramble about my favorite books. And I would love to hear you talk about your favorite books in the comments. So tell me about your perfectly paced books. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. Thanks again for watching. Be good to yourselves. Be good to each other as always. I will see you on the next video. Take care.